With those 5 hallmarks, and I believe all of them to various degrees are present in true revival. But do remember, revivals are not all the same. They don't come in the same pattern. One of the lovely things about revival is that God takes the normal things that we do and he brings them into a new sphere. So, for example, when God comes to a group of people that may be, let's just take hymn singing, that are singing modern hymns and modern songs, the best of modern hymns and the best of modern songs, when revival comes, that's what they continue doing, but there's a new life within them. Conversely, when God came to the Highlands and Islands in the 1950s, in the time of Duncan Campbell, for example, the people were singing unaccompanied metrical psalms. And when revival came, they carried on singing unaccompanied metrical psalms. But there was new life in that. So we cannot ever put God in a little box and say this is God's shape of revival. In fact, the more we read about the revival, the more we're uncertain what God is likely to do. But I come back to the 5 hallmarks, and if I were to pick out one of those hallmarks, it would undoubtedly be the first I've mentioned. And that is an awesome sense of the presence of God. One of the realities, or if you like, unrealities that we face in our churches today, and it's right across the board of Bible-believing evangelical churches, is a lack of the sense of the presence of God. Something I think Paul was talking about when he wrote to the Corinthians. And he said to them, if I may paraphrase Paul for a moment, when the unbeliever comes in, he should fall down and say, God is in this place. 1 Corinthians 14. And I have to say, how often does that happen in our congregations? And I believe it's exactly the same of what Moses was talking about when in Exodus 33, Moses longed for God to go with him. And in fact, he went further and said, I'm not prepared to take these people into the promised land unless you come with me, unless your presence goes with me. And he went further and said, how will they know, the nations know, that we are your people and different from all the other nations unless your presence goes with me? And God's reply was, my presence will go with you. Now in the Hebrew, that word my presence is pani, my face, literally my face. My face will go with you. That is what we are missing, the face, the presence of God. And you could read any revival of anywhere, and the one thing you will come up with again and again and again are phrases like the presence of God, the awesome presence of God. I'd like to illustrate this to you because I think it is so important and it makes a point. I'm going to read some excerpts from the presence of God in revival from all over the world. And as it were, sit back and listen, because this, I think, is very moving. We'll go back to August 1727 and the remarkable work that God did among the little company of exiles at Herrnhut on the Saxony, the estate of Count Ludwig von Zinzendorf in Saxony. They were a pretty mixed up group. They came from a lot of different backgrounds. There were a lot of squabbling among them. And then one day, after a season of prayer, the Spirit of God came down in a most remarkable way. On Wednesday the 13th of August 1727, when God came among the small community of exiles at Herrnhut on the estate of Count Nicholas von Zinzendorf in Saxony, he records, a sense of the nearness of Christ was given us all at the same moment. What the Lord did for Herrnhut from that time till the winter of the same year is inexpressible. The whole place appeared like a visible tabernacle of God with men. Similarly, one report of the revival in Cambuslang in 1742, after Whitefield had been preaching, speaks of, quote, the gracious and sensible, that means felt, presence of God. In 1839 in Dundee, St. Mary McChain expressed the same experience like this of St. Peter's. The private meetings for prayer have spread a sweet influence over the whole place. A prayer meeting attended by thousands in Wales in 1859 left one man aware only of God. He walked away in awesome silence. A friend stopped him and commented, "What a glorious sight that was when the thousands were engaged in a spirit of prayer." At Mr. Morgan's request, "Did you ever see anything like it, Mr. John?" And he answered solemnly, "I didn't see one of them. I saw no one but God. I'm going home. How terrible is this place? It is too terrible for me. My flesh is too weak to bear the weight of glory." In the same province, Rhys Bevan-Jones commented on the years 1904 to 1905 in Wales, I quote, "A sense of the Lord's presence was everywhere. It pervaded, nay, it created the spiritual atmosphere. It mattered not where one went, the consciousness of the reality and nearness of God followed." He described a scene in Anglesey during which one of the most powerful meetings he ever experienced in Wales in 1904 took place. This is what he wrote. "The whole place at that moment was awful with the glory of God. One uses the word awful deliberately. The holy presence of God was so manifested that the speaker himself was overwhelmed. The pulpit where he stood was so filled with the light of God that he had to withdraw. There, let us leave it at that. Words cannot but mock such an experience." End quote. You'll find these expressions frequently whenever you read of revival. The house was often so full of the divine presence that ungodly men trembled terror-stricken. People could feel the presence of God, even at a distance from the town. In faraway Australia in 1905, incidentally really a grandchild of the 1904 revival in Wales, God was at work at meetings in Bowden Methodist Church. The congregations were reluctant to leave, and I quote, "Manifestations of the divine presence and power were marked and felt by all present." In 1906, who incidentally had been sent by his congregation because he was near to a breakdown. He was in Charlotte Chapel in Edinburgh and had worked very hard and was near to a breakdown. That they sent him to Bournemouth to recuperate. But he was so tired of seeing so many people being wheeled around in what were then called bath chairs that he decided to take himself to Wales, where he'd heard of something remarkable that was going on. And when he left Wales and went back in 1905 to Charlotte Chapel, God did an amazing work there. He carried unknowingly the revival fire back with him. And this is what he wrote. "Quite suddenly, upon one and another came an overwhelming sense of the reality and awesomeness of his presence and of eternal things." Similarly, in January 1907, another grandchild of the Welsh revival, when God came among his people in North Korea, a missionary records, each felt as he entered the church that the room was full of God's presence. That night in Pyongyang, we've all heard of Pyongyang, there was a sense of the nearness of God, impossible of description. And that leads me to, as an aside, to mention something that is similar in so many revivals. There isn't time to outline them, but again and again revival comes where God's people are preparing unknowingly, or God is preparing them unknown to them for a period of very severe persecution. That's why I drew your attention to North Korea. In Shantung, China, same picture, 1908, the presence of God seemed completely to fill the building and the people could hardly even pray. Coming back home, the last significant revival, if you wouldn't quibble on the word significant there, but the last significant revival in England, as opposed to the entire United Kingdom or Great Britain, was in Lowestoft and Great Yarmouth in 1921. This is actually their centenary year. And it came to London Road Baptist Church in quite a remarkable way after a group of people had been praying regularly every Monday for some time. And I read, Among the fishing ports on the east coast of England in 1921, tough, burly fishermen were giving testimony to how God had dealt with them. Now, these fishermen came from the east coast of Scotland. They came round fishing for herring as they came. They arrived, unloaded, and the wives' job was a pretty smelly job, was to pickle those herring, put them in barrels, and off they went. But during that time, many of these fishermen were beautifully converted. And they went back and took the gospel to the east coast of Scotland, and in some cases entire villages became turned to Christ as a result of their witness. But here are these men. As these recently converted people got up and told how and when they were saved, the atmosphere was charged, here's the phrase again, with the presence of God. It's recorded in Yarmouth that year, the entire town was in the grip of the presence of God. So evident was this, that even the Yarmouth and Galston Times, the local rag for the 10th of November 1921, reported, quote, "God has become very near." Phrases such as an awesome awareness of God, the powerful presence of God, a sense of God's presence in the town are used to describe the atmosphere at that time. You know, the presence of God like this defies human explanation. Duncan Campbell claimed, "I have no hesitation in saying that the awareness of God is the most crying need of the church today. It can't be made up for by counterfeit religious sobriety on the one hand, or enthusiastic wildness on the other. They are no substitute. It's this sense of God's presence that compels a reverent awe of God. Or, as Jeremiah 5:22 reminds us, "Should you not fear me, declares the Lord, should you not tremble in my presence?"